Welcome to the debate. Imagine asking a brilliant surgeon how they know a patient's bone is broken.
Well, they would just walk you over to a light board, right? Slap an x-ray up there.
Exactly, and just point to a jagged white line. It is completely visible, binary even. The method of diagnosis is transparent. But now, go ask a master architect how they knew a specific sweeping, curved wall was the exact right solution for a building's flow.
Or even a software architect, how they conceptualized an elegant database structure.
Yeah, often they just pause. Maybe they look at their hands and say something like, well, it just felt right when I was sketching. Or, I understood it once I started playing with the constraints.
Which is wild, right? Why does one of our most vital, world-shaping professions sound so utterly unscientific when asked to explain itself?
And historically, that exact inability to articulate a clear sequential method was viewed by the academic establishment as a massive flaw.
Oh, absolutely. The assumption has always gone, if you are a serious, rigorous discipline, you must have an explicit, transferable method.
Right. If you cannot speak your method, you are just fumbling in the dark. Yet, our source text today, the silent knowledge shown in Cross on design epistemology, argues that this inability to speak the method is not a defect whatsoever.
It is actually the defining key to understanding how design epistemology works. It proves that design knowledge cannot simply be derived from the hard sciences.
Exactly. It exists as its own unique, robust form of knowing, which forces us to look past the silence and ask the foundational question: where does this silent knowledge actually reside?
Right, because if it isn't in a textbook and it isn't in a scientific formula, how do we map the architecture of this knowledge?
And that is the central puzzle we are exploring today. I argue that the essence of this design knowledge is fundamentally individual and situational. It is best understood through Donald Schön's framework of the individual practitioner's reflection in action.
Meaning it lives in the hands, basically.
Literally in the hand of the designer. And it is bound to the immediate, highly unique context of the work itself.
Well, I take the opposing view. I argue that the essence of design knowledge is inherently collective and cultural. It is best understood through Nigel Cross's perspective of a shared disciplinary framework.
So less about the individual gut feeling.
Much less. Design isn't just a collection of scattered individual reflexes or singular moments of intuition. It is a rich, nonverbal cultural language that shapes the artificial world.
Okay, to truly grasp the stakes of this, we need to lay the groundwork by looking at Donald Schön's 1983 seminal work, The Reflective Practitioner. To understand his intervention, we have to understand the rigid academic hierarchy he was fighting against.
You mean what Schön calls technical rationality?
Yes. For decades, that was the dominant model of professional knowledge.
It was the deeply entrenched scientific model of the professions. Literally the gold standard that every discipline was desperately trying to emulate.
And it is beautifully simple in theory, but disastrous in certain practices. The assumption of technical rationality is that experts learn pure scientific theory in an isolated academic setting.
And then they march out into the world and apply that theory to clean, well-defined problems.
Right. Like, if you want to design a suspension bridge, you apply the immutable physics of load-bearing structures. The problem is a math equation, and the solution is derived from a universally applicable formula.
But Schön accurately points out that this entirely misrepresents the messy reality of what we call design practice.
Completely. Because design problems, whether planning a city layout or creating a user interface, do not present themselves as clean, categorized equations.
No, they are complex, contradictory, deeply entangled with unpredictable human behavior. Schön uses this brilliant geographical analogy from the text to illustrate this disconnect. He says technical rationality operates on the high, hard ground of pure theory. Up on that high ground, you can solve problems using rigorous, rule-based techniques. It feels safe up there. But down below, there is a swampy lowland.
Right, and this swamp is filled with messy, confusing, inherently unstable, but vastly more important human problems. The swamp is where the formulas break down because the variables are constantly shifting.
Exactly. Design happens entirely in the swamp. To explain how a practitioner operates in that swamp, think about it like being hired to fix a company's plummeting sales. Technical rationality assumes the problem is simply a mathematical pricing issue, so you pull the lower the price formula off the shelf.
But the designer wades into the swamp of the company, right? They talk to users, observe the logistics, and realize the problem isn't price at all. The problem is that the product is incredibly confusing to unbox and assemble. The designer had to engage in what Schön calls problem setting.
So they had to figure out what they were even trying to solve first.
Yes, before you can apply any theory, you have to extract a workable problem from a chaotic situation, and that cognitive skill is entirely situational. It is an embodied knowing and action held by the individual practitioner in that exact moment.
It is a compelling image, I will give you that. The solitary practitioner wading through the mud, making sense of the chaos. But reducing the entire discipline of design to individual, tacit, hand knowledge or a singular person problem setting in the swamp completely misses the macro-structural reality of the profession.
How so?
Well, to see how this knowledge actually functions at scale, we have to zoom out to Nigel Cross's 1982 framework from his paper Designerly Ways of Knowing. Cross argues that design is not just a collection of solitary individuals trusting their gut in the mud. It is a fully realized third culture, standing robustly and equally alongside the sciences and the humanities.
So he treats it as a distinct culture with its own complete epistemology rather than a bastardized version of science.
Yes, and he unpacks the mechanics of this third culture by comparing it directly to the other two pillars. Think about how science operates. Science studies the natural world. Its primary method is experiment and analysis, breaking things apart to find a single, objective truth.
And the humanities?
The humanities, conversely, study human experience. Their methods are analogy, metaphor, and criticism. And their ultimate values revolve around justice, insight, and subjective meaning.
Which basically leaves design completely unaccounted for in traditional academia.
Which is exactly why Cross defines it as a co-equal third pillar. Design studies the artificial world, the world of objects, systems, and structures that do not yet exist, but are brought into being by human intention.
And its method isn't analysis, it is modeling and synthesis.
Precisely. While a scientist isolates variables to find a single truth, a designer takes a dozen conflicting variables, a tight budget, the laws of gravity, aesthetic desires, human ergonomics, and they synthesize them into a single, cohesive model.
So the model itself is the method of knowing.
Yes, and its core values are practicality and appropriateness. When a designer makes a decision, they aren't just relying on an individual knowing in action. They are drawing upon a massive shared cultural library embedded in the physical objects of the past, the traditions of the studio, and the shared values of appropriateness. The knowledge is a collective cultural inheritance.
Okay, but if we want to locate where that knowledge actually sparks into existence, we have to look at how it operates in real time. Because the moment of discovery, the moment of actual creation, is where Schön's theory truly proves itself over a broad macrocultural theory.
You mean during the actual drafting process?
Right. Discovery happens through what Schön calls reflection in action. Let's picture a designer working. They make a physical move. They are shaping a piece of physical wood, or perhaps they're drafting a structural joint on a screen.
And the material reacts.
Exactly. The material gives an unexpected response. The wood splinters in a strange way, or the drafted lines reveal a spatial conflict that was not apparent in the designer's mind. The designer perceives this physical feedback and pivots immediately in real time.
I see where you are going with this.
Yeah, I see why you think that broader culture matters, but let me give you a different perspective. This process is literally a conversation with the situation.
A conversation implies a language, though.
It is a physical dialogue. The designer speaks to the material through a physical action, and the material speaks back through its physical resistance or compliance. The knowledge doesn't exist before this interaction. It is generated in the microseconds of action.
You think it is just generated out of nowhere?
It cannot possibly be pulled from some pre-existing cultural library because the specific messiness of this exact piece of wood in this specific room under these exact atmospheric constraints has never existed before in human history. The knowledge is hyper-localized to the individual sensory loop.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are describing the interaction as if the designer arrives at the drafting table as a complete blank slate, merely reacting to physical stimuli like a single-celled organism prodded by a needle.
Not a blank slate, just reacting to the immediate reality.
But Cross observes something fundamental about how designers operate that completely refutes this purely reactive model. Designers are uniquely solution-focused.
Meaning they jump to proposing the end result rather than lingering on the initial constraint?
Precisely, and the mechanics of why they do that are crucial. Let's contrast it with science again. A scientist looks at a phenomenon and tries to isolate all the variables to deeply, perfectly understand the problem before ever proposing a solution. That is problem-focused.
True. Designers do jump in very quickly.
Right. A designer looks at a complex brief and almost immediately proposes a solution. They draw a sketch, they build a rough prototype. They don't just converse aimlessly with materials to see what happens. They use specific, culturally inherited methods of proposing solutions to understand the parameters of the problem itself. The proposed solution acts as a probe.
So the act of proposing the solution is actually the mechanism for Schön's problem setting.
Yes, but the crucial point is that the way they propose it is entirely cultural. When they draw a line and realize there is a spatial conflict, they only recognize that conflict because they have internalized the grammar of the discipline.
You are saying the conversation with the material isn't a spontaneous creation of knowledge.
Exactly. It is dictated by a shared language. The discipline provides the vocabulary for that conversation. Without the cultural framework of what constitutes a good or appropriate joint, the splintering wood is just meaningless noise. It isn't a conversation at all without the culture interpreting the material's answers.
I appreciate how you link the solution probe to the culture. But that vocabulary you speak of is completely useless without the individual's tacit ability to deploy it, especially in a situation that breaks all the rules of the grammar.
Breaks the rules?
Yes, the solution-focused approach you are mentioning actually firmly supports Schön's concept. Why do they propose a solution right away? Because the problem in the swampy lowland is so incredibly disorganized that the only way to figure out what you're even trying to solve is to make a physical move.
But they make a structured move.
Sure, the cultural theory might sound nice in a lecture hall, but in practice, the knowledge is entirely bounded by the practitioner's immediate personal sensory feedback loop. It is an internal bodily mechanism.
But the criteria the practitioner uses to evaluate that personal feedback loop, deciding whether the wood splintering is a happy accident that leads to a new aesthetic or a fatal flaw that compromises the structure, comes directly from the collective values of the third culture.
You mean evaluating for practicality?
Yes, evaluating for practicality and appropriateness, which are Cross's defining values of design. You simply cannot have a meaningful conversation with a situation if you haven't been enculturated into how to read the material.
Well, to test whether this is an individual physical reflex or a collective language, we have to look at why this epistemology has been so notoriously difficult to categorize in academia. Let's talk about design's fierce resistance to scientification.
Oh, the endless attempts to turn design into a math problem?
Exactly. For decades, there were massive, well-funded academic movements trying to turn design into a hard science. They desperately wanted to pull design out of the swamp and onto the high, hard ground.
The design methods movement of the 1960s is the prime historical example of this.
Perfectly said. They tried to create algorithms for the perfect building. They tried to build mathematical formulas for the ultimate, frictionless urban layout. And they failed spectacularly.
They did. It didn't work at all.
And they failed precisely because of Schön's individual situational view of the swamp. You cannot mathematically map a swamp. When you try to algorithmically design a housing project based purely on optimal spatial efficiency, you end up with spaces that humans actively hate living in, because human community dynamics are messy, contradictory, and entirely situational.
I agree it resists science, but...
Wait, let me finish this thought. The knowledge is so implicit, so deeply tied to specific, unrepeatable situations, that it can never be reduced to universal scientific rules. If design were primarily a shared, objective culture with clear grammatical rules, as you suggest, we would be much closer to codifying it scientifically. But it constantly evades that codification because the core engine of the knowledge relies on the individual practitioner's real-time reflection and action.
That's a compelling argument, But have you considered that design's resistance to science is only half of the epistemological story? The source text makes a point to emphasize that while design resists scientification, it also vigorously resists artification.
Ah, the tendency to mystify the process into pure subjective expression.
Right. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, isn't this just art? Aren't they just waiting for a muse to strike? That is exactly the trap Nigel Cross is trying to avoid.
So it isn't just about pure inspiration.
Not at all. If design knowledge were purely individual brilliance, purely a localized, tacit conversation happening in the isolated practitioner's own mind and hands, it would just be art. It would be entirely subjective.
But it has functional constraints.
Exactly. It resists becoming pure art precisely because, as Cross notes, it is a rigorous discipline with shared criteria, traditions, and methods passed across generations. Consider the reality of architectural critique.
Okay, like in a studio review?
Yes. A senior architect can look at a junior architect's draft and immediately point out a structural or conceptual flaw, even if that senior architect has never visited the specific swampy lowland of that specific client or site.
Even though they haven't had the conversation with the material.
Yet they can still meaningfully critique it. That proves there is an underlying collective epistemology at play. They share Cross's third culture.
I see what you are saying.
Because if the knowledge were entirely situational and individually embodied in the junior architect's hands, no objective critique would be possible. The senior architect wouldn't have access to the knowing and action of that specific moment. The fact that the profession can self-regulate and critique its members proves the knowledge is cultural.
But notice how often those critiques actually break down in practice?
What do you mean?
That critique is often highly subjective and fraught precisely because the senior architect lacks a situational awareness of the original designer's struggle with the material. When we look at the dual resistance to both science and art, Schön's framework actually provides the most elegant explanation.
How does Schön explain the resistance to art?
Well, why does it resist science? Because it relies on tacit knowing and action rather than explicit formulas. Why does it resist art? Because it operates on real-world constraints, materials, client budgets, gravity, which force a pragmatic problem-setting exercise rather than pure self-expression.
So you are saying it is the friction of reality that keeps it from being art?
Exactly. The silent knowledge is just that, silent. It is the signature of a practice that lives entirely in the friction of doing.
While that is true in a vacuum, I argue the silence is not a lack of words. It is a different kind of vocabulary entirely. It is a robust, nonverbal cultural discipline. The knowledge is carried in the artifacts themselves.
In the objects.
Yes. An industrial designer drafting a chair today carries the embedded, synthesized knowledge of centuries of chair making. The designer taps into that lineage through modeling. They do not invent the concept of chair making from scratch in their own individual swamp.
Okay, if we want to firmly establish whether this knowledge is fundamentally an individual reflex or a collective lineage, the ultimate test is how it is actually transmitted to the next generation of practitioners.
You mean design education?
Yes. Let's ground this theoretical debate in the practical epistemology of the design studio. The studio education model is, to my mind, the ultimate empirical proof of Schön's theory. Think about how we teach architecture, industrial design, or even high-level software engineering.
The pedagogy is deeply traditional and entirely distinct from a standard university lecture hall.
Absolutely. Students do not sit in a sterile room absorbing a shared culture through textbooks, multiple-choice exams, and slide presentations. They sit at drafting tables.
Or standing in workshops, making physical models.
Right. And a master practitioner comes around, looks at their work, and often says almost nothing at all. They just pick up a pencil and draw directly over the student's work, or they physically reshape the model with their hands.
The famous and often intimidating desk crit. Exactly, the master demonstrates. They might say, look at what happens when you do this. But the words are secondary. The student learns by doing alongside the master.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because if design were truly a shared, rigid culture with a clear grammatical structure like you argue, it could be codified.
You think we could just write it down?
We could write it down in a comprehensive manual and test students on it. The undeniable fact that design must be physically demonstrated, that it requires the master's hands to physically guide the student's hands, proves that it is an individual embodied knowing. The knowledge is entirely experiential and situational. You cannot teach a set of rules. You can only teach the hands through direct action.
Well, I come at it from a different way. You are misinterpreting the mechanics of what is actually happening during that silent desk crit. The master isn't just transferring mindless muscle memory or teaching the student how to have an isolated private conversation with a piece of paper.
Then what are they doing?
As the text explicitly states, entering the design discipline is like being born into a language. The master is enculturating the student into the third culture.
By simply altering a physical sketch without speaking?
Yes, by demonstrating the values embedded in that physical alteration. When the master alters the student's sketch, they are not just showing a hand technique, they are teaching them the shared values of practicality and appropriateness. They are showing them how a designer approaches the synthesis of conflicting variables.
But they aren't verbalizing those rules.
You assume that because it isn't written in a textbook, it isn't a culture. But think about how we learn our native spoken language as infants. We don't learn it from a grammar textbook. We learn it through constant immersion in a community of fluent speakers.
Through exposure, trial, and imitation.
Precisely. The design studio is an immersive cultural environment where the student is adopted into Cross's third culture. They are learning the collective way of knowing that shapes the artificial world. The silence of the design studio isn't the silence of isolated individuals fumbling in the dark. It is the silence of a shared, nonverbal language being fluently spoken between master and apprentice.
But observe the actual mechanism of that immersion. It relies entirely on the student's own internal capacity for reflection and action.
It relies on the environment, though. Sure, but the master eventually leaves the desk. The student is left completely alone with the messy reality of their materials and their constraints. They have to internalize the cognitive process of problem setting for themselves.
Guided by what they just saw.
Yes, but the culture might provide a historical backdrop. The actual epistemology, the precise moment a student transitions from not knowing to knowing, happens in the friction between their specific hand, their specific mind, and the specific material they are manipulating in that exact second.
The friction is absolutely necessary, I agree, but without the cultural framework guiding it, that friction produces nothing of lasting value. It produces noise, not design. The studio teaches the student how to take the noise of the swamp and transform it into the structured reality of the artificial world.
Using the inherited tools, models, and values? Exactly. Using the tools of the discipline.
Let's summarize where we stand on this silent knowledge, as this brings us to the core tension of the text. I maintain that the true engine of design epistemology is the individual's reflection and action.
The hands in the swamp.
Right. It is a deeply personal, tacit conversation with messy materials in the unpredictable, swampy lowlands of practice. It is knowing in action, residing fundamentally in the hands and the immediate situation of the practitioner.
And I maintain that this silence is actually the signature of a rich, nonverbal cultural discipline. It is a collective way of knowing, a distinct third culture, standing separate from the analytical sciences and the critical humanities, that uses modeling and solution-focused methods to shape the artificial world.
What we certainly converge on, and what Schön and Cross both make abundantly clear in the source material, is that design knowledge is distinctly its own beast.
Oh, absolutely. It refuses to be reduced to the universal, sterile formulas of technical rationality.
And it equally refuses to be elevated into the pure, subjective mysticism of fine art.
We completely agree on that fundamental point. It is its own distinct epistemology with its own valid ways of knowing. Our disagreement really just remains on which scale truly generates this knowledge.
Right. Is it born at the micro level of the individual's hands and immediate physical reflexes? Or is it generated at the macro level of the collective culture and shared disciplinary traditions?
Exactly.
Understanding complex material often requires viewing it through multiple scales simultaneously. There is far more depth to explore in the concepts of design epistemology, from problem setting to the nature of the third culture. And we invite you to dive into the source text to form your own conclusions.
Yeah, the next time you interact with a beautifully designed object or navigate a well-planned architectural space, ask yourself where the knowledge to create it really lives. Is it contained in the singular, reflecting mind of the creator in that specific moment? Or does it live in the long shadow of the culture they belong to?
Because whether you believe the truth lies in the muddy boots of the practitioner wading through the swamp, or in the grand shared architecture of a nonverbal cultural language, one thing is certain: that simple, silent X-ray machine of pure scientific precision will never capture the whole picture. Thank you for listening.